The Bible doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about the Moabites. It does suggest that the Moabites were cousins of a sort of the Israelites, claiming that their patriarch was Lot, the nephew of Abraham. However, if you remember that story, the basic suggestion is that Lot's line continued because his daughter got him drunk and got pregnant off of him, which is just not the sort of origin story you tell about a group of people you like. To quote the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Moabite language differed only dialectically from Hebrew, and the Moabite religion and culture were very closely related to that of the Israelites. Nevertheless, the Moabites were excluded from the Jewish community, where the name Moab became a typical denomination for the enemies of God. So the Moabites were sort of an old school version of the Samaritans, close cousins, deeply hated, enough so that Moabite became synonymous with enemy of God. And into that reality comes the reading from Isaiah today. We have been working on a women's lectionary for the whole church, translated by Dr. Wilda Gaffney, who makes an intentional choice to translate Zion and Jerusalem in the feminine as they are in Hebrew. To make it clear to the English speaker the constancy of this feminine, she reproduces daughter in places where English masks the frequency of the feminine address. This has resulted in a lot of daughters in our recent readings, which may, in this case, create some confusion for those who heard the text today. So let me clarify. In the New Revised Standard Version of this Isaiah passage, the translators tell daughter Zion to care for the daughters of Moab. As Dr. Gaffney says, God calls on her daughter Zion, Jerusalem, to welcome her Moabite sisters in their time of need. Israel's relationship with her border states was perpetually tumultuous, even with shared ties. Often in the Hebrew scriptures, foreign women are treated as prospective danger, irresistible to Israelite men through sexual wiles, leading to Israelite men straying from their God. But in Isaiah 16, God calls on Israel to care for these vulnerable women. The Bible has pretty much nothing nice to say about the Moabites. But when they are struggling and in danger, the people are told to shelter them, really to save them. And that's pretty far from Paul's love your enemies so God will judge them and drop heaping coals on their heads. It sounds a whole lot more like love your enemies because they're the beloveds of God too and worthy humans at that. These were the people the Israelites were at war with more often than not, and they're told to welcome them, shelter them, and keep them safe. There is, you may remember, another place where the Bible has something rather nice to say about the Moabites, which is that Ruth was one, and she was pretty great. This is a thing I love about the Bible. It's unable to sit tight with violence and hatred. It just can't keep God's love from seeping in, even with the ones it struggles with the most. And as anyone who has ever attempted to explain the Good Samaritan parable knows, you have to start with explaining the enmity between the Israelites and the Samaritans to get to the point of the Samaritan being the hero. Or after the horrible defeat of Jerusalem by Babylon, the exiles are told to seek the good of the city of Babylon. The Bible doesn't make peace with hatred. There's always light shining through. As much as the people struggle with each other, God's love for all cannot ever be extinguished. And truly, I even think the people tried. Their grief and fear and anger created enormous blinders to the humanity of others, the outsiders, the enemies. But God's work to transform it is also always there, nudging away the blinders to see the beloveds of God underneath. So, I believe that Jesus' command to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us is well known, but I think maybe we don't spend enough time talking about the skill sets to actually do so. This week, I picked up a book by my favorite seminary professor, Andy Dreitzer. The book is entitled Living Compassionately, Loving Like Jesus, and in the introduction, I found myself remembering why he was my favorite professor. He talked about his own struggles with loving his enemies and trying so hard to love people, which he's actually really great at, only to discover that telling himself he should wasn't the same as actually doing so. He said, "The constant efforts to manufacture acts of love because my faith demands it, even when I don't feel loving, may lead me to a sense of guilty inadequacy or a sense of failure, or ultimately to burnout." The honesty of that was such a relief. And he didn't leave it there. He acknowledged it, but then he came around to the heart of the Christian path of love. Radical compassion can be taught. And then he spends the rest of the book teaching it. In recent years, one of the most common questions I've been asked has been about how to remain connected to people on the other side of the political spectrum. And this is a wonderful question. It's a loving question, and it's a real question. We may know that politics are just politics and that outsiders are trying to divide us and that people matter more than their stances on some issues. But at the same time, the most deeply held beliefs we have about what the world looks like and what it should look like are often in contrast to what people on the other side of that spectrum believe. And in cases of the violation of our most deeply held values and beliefs, it can be an actual challenge to find shared humanity. So I've really appreciated people acknowledging how hard that is and trying to do it anyway. And I've offered some answers and suggestions to those who have asked, potentially even something vaguely helpful if I'm lucky. I've suggested listening for other people's values and digging in deep until the similarities of desires can be found, even if the solutions aren't shared. I've suggested acknowledging that others are struggling and making space for that struggle, particularly for the fear that is so prevalent in our society. But between this Isaiah passage about sheltering one's enemies and the book on compassion, my answers are sounding pretty weak to my own ears. I wish now I had started by offering people compassion for the struggle they brought to me, and in doing so modeled the compassion that I think we need for such work. Dr. Dreitzer reminded me that from my own faith position, compassion flows three ways: between God, the other, and the self. And that when we are struggling to offer compassion to another, we may first need to make space to experience God's compassion for us and/or take time to have compassion for ourselves first. We cannot browbeat compassion out of ourselves or pick it up by our bootstraps. And then I wish I had reminded myself and others that by offering vulnerability, we make space for the sort of intimacy we want with others. If the goal is to remain connected with people we care about, then there are skill sets for that. Now, I suspect you are ready for the easy fix on being more compassionate. I sort of want to give it to you, but there isn't one. It's the stuff of long, regular practice and starts and stops and learning by doing and taking time for what matters. It's the stuff of good spiritual practice. Dr. Dreitzer recommends intentional spiritual practices focused on intention, attention, awareness, intimacy, imagination, and feelings. Just that. I offer this. We are blessed with new committees working on relationships and spiritual formation. And the work of those groups will continue to offer to all of us the means of developing our compassion so that the actual practice of loving our enemies, those skills can be developed, even if we want to define our enemies as just those who really exhaust us. I think this is all good news. It's good news that God doesn't want us to stay in enmity with others. And it's good news that there are actual ways to build compassion so we don't just have to feel guilty when we aren't as loving as we want to be. It's good news. And we can work on it together. And it is good news to be a part of faith community where becoming more compassionate is part of what we are trying to do together. We are in this together. May God help us along our way. Amen.